You're about to read 9 stories that will make you think twice before you check into an unfamiliar rental, step onto your back porch at night, or walk into a dark hallway alone. These are not fiction. These are not campfire tales invented to get a reaction. These are accounts told by real Americans. A nurse, a pizza delivery driver, a farmer's son, a night shift clerk, a young couple in a brand new home. People who were living completely ordinary lives until something shattered that ordinary completely. Every single story in this collection happened in the United States. Some took place in states you've driven through. Some happened in towns that sound a lot like your own. A few occurred in places that, on paper, should have felt completely safe. Read these one at a time. Read them with the lights on. And whatever you do, don't read the last one alone at night. Something in the desert. I booked the place myself. That part is important. I made the choice, I found the listing, I hit confirm. I was heading to Tucson for a job interview at a mid-sized logistics firm, and since the drive from home would have taken 5 hours round trip, it made more sense to just stay out there for a few days. The Airbnb I settled on was roughly 40 minutes outside the city, which was further than ideal. But the price difference compared to anything near downtown was nearly impossible to ignore. We're talking about half the nightly rate. That adds up. The property sat at the end of a gravel road off a 2-lane highway. No neighbors in immediate sight. Nothing but open desert out back. Saguaro cacti, creosote brush, dry rocky earth glowing amber in the afternoon sun. I remember thinking it was actually beautiful. I set my bags down, opened my laptop, and got to work. Remote work during the day, interview prep at night. Simple enough. My interview was on a Tuesday. I arrived Sunday evening and planned to leave Thursday morning. So Monday night, the night before, I was sitting in the living room going over typical behavioral questions, researching the company's recent earnings reports, making sure I knew exactly what they did and how I could contribute. It was probably 9 o'clock. The TV was off. The desert was quiet. And then there was a tap on the window. Not a knock. Not the kind of thing you'd expect from a person standing outside and wanting your attention. This was a single, deliberate tap, like a fingernail pressed once against the glass. My head whipped left toward the window. My heart immediately picked up the pace. Outside was complete darkness. The desert doesn't do ambient light. There are no street lamps, no passing cars, no neighboring houses lit up in the distance. I made myself get up and look. Nothing. Just the silhouette of brush against a black sky. I told myself it was probably a beetle. Arizona has some impressive insects. Big, heavy-bodied things that smack into glass like they don't care. I went back to my laptop and kept studying. Tuesday went fine. The interview went well. I felt good about my answers, shook hands with the right people, sent a follow-up email before I even got back to the house. The remaining days I spent like a tourist. Local restaurants, a drive out to a state park, an hour in the backyard chair with a paperback and a cold drink. It felt like a genuinely good little trip. Tuesday night, I was watching a show on my laptop in the living room. Same spot as before. It was probably 10:30. The tap happened again. One tap. Single. Intentional. It was not a bug. The certainty of that hit me hard and fast. I went to the window again, pressed my face close to the glass to see through the glare, and saw nothing. I moved to the front door, cracked it open, scanned the driveway and the road. Nothing. I went to the back door next, stepped onto the rear patio and faced the open desert. Dead quiet. No wind. Then, a click. It came from out in the desert, maybe 60 or 70 feet away. Not a mechanical sound, not an animal. It was the sound of someone clicking their tongue against the roof of their mouth. Slow, casual, like someone who was very comfortable being exactly where they were. I yelled into the darkness. The click came back, almost like a response, and then I saw the figure. A person standing just beyond where the porch light reached, dressed in dark clothing, completely still. I took a few steps toward them before every rational instinct had told me to stop. I raised my voice and told them they were on private property and that I was calling the police if they didn't leave immediately. The figure turned and walked away in a way that I can only describe as eerily fluid. Too smooth. Too unbothered. I told myself it was probably the property owner doing some kind of late-night check. But I didn't believe it. The next night, I lay in bed with the lights off, laptop open, same show running. Nothing happened for a while. Then, sometime around midnight, I heard it again. Muffled, close, the click sound. From inside the closet. The closet door was open a crack. I was out of that bed before I consciously made the decision to move. I grabbed my keys off the nightstand, ran through the front door in my pajamas, and sat in my rental car, in the driveway with all the doors locked and the engine running. I called 911 from there, watching the front of the house, waiting to see if anyone came out while all my belongings were still inside. A cruiser arrived within 12 minutes. We did a sweep of the property together. It was small enough. The officer and I checked every room, every closet, every corner. We found no one. No forced entry. Nothing disturbed. But I still packed everything into that rental car and drove to the nearest chain hotel before 1 in the morning. I reached out to the host and the platform. I received a partial refund and a polite non-answer. To this day, my best guess is that whoever had access to that house had a key. And the person in the desert, maybe the same person, maybe not, knew the property, knew the layout, knew which window faced the living room. I got the job, by the way. I turned it down. I never went back to that part of Arizona. The radio in the yard. My wife, Donna, and I had been together for 11 years before we finally got married. We bought our house less than 3 weeks after the wedding. A 4-bedroom colonial on the edge of a small town in rural Georgia, backed up against a 1/4 acre of forest. It was exactly what we wanted. Big yard for the dog we planned to adopt. Room for kids to run around someday. A quiet street. The first 2 nights were fine. We were unpacking, arguing over where to put the bookshelf, ordering too much takeout. Normal newlywed in a new home stuff. It wasn't until Monday night, our 3rd night there, that something went wrong. We had just turned off the lights, maybe 20 minutes had passed. And then, from somewhere outside, specifically from the direction of our backyard, music started playing. Not faint background noise, not a neighbor's stereo bleeding through a fence. This was full volume, clear, and it was coming from our yard. Dana sat up at the same time I did. We just looked at each other in the dark. I opened my bedroom window and the sound rushed in. An old, scratchy, almost cinematic recording. The kind of song that sounds like it was pressed onto a wax cylinder in 1943. I looked it up later. It was Who's Afraid of the Big Bad Wolf, a Depression-era tune with a bouncy, unsettling melody that sounds perfectly cheerful until it's blaring from your backyard at 11 at night. Then it sounds like a threat. I ran downstairs, hit the backyard lights, and stepped outside. No one visible. The music was louder out there, and tracking it by sound, I realized it wasn't coming from my yard at all. It was coming from the tree line, from inside the woods. The song finished. Silence returned. I went back inside, told Dana it was probably some teenagers hazing the new family on the block. I said it calmly. I didn't feel calm. There is no logical reason for anyone to play vintage 1940s recordings at full volume in the woods behind a stranger's house. The next night, it happened again. We'd barely been in bed for 10 minutes. This time, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. If you know that song, you know it already has a creep factor built in. Hearing it waft through your open bedroom window from a dark patch of woods behind your house while you're lying in bed next to your new wife is a level of wrong I cannot adequately put into words. I looked out the window and saw something in the grass. An object. Small. Sitting in the middle of the yard. I told Dinah I was going out to check it. She told me to call the police. I said I would in a minute. I had this image in my head of being the man who wasn't scared in his own backyard, of sending a clear message to whoever thought this was funny. The object was an old portable radio, a vintage-style unit, beat up, sitting in my grass like it had been placed there deliberately. I picked it up by the handle, turned the volume down, looked up at the window where Dana was watching, and held it over my head like I'd found the answer. That's when Dana started screaming my name. She screamed, "Run." I yelled back, asking why. She screamed that there are people standing behind you. I turned around. 3 figures stood at the edge of the woods, evenly spaced, perfectly still, facing me, not running at me, not waving, just standing there watching, in complete silence, like they'd been waiting for me to turn around. I don't remember deciding to run. I just remember being inside with the door locked. Police arrived, took the radio as evidence, swept the tree line with flashlights. They found nothing, or at least told us nothing. The figures didn't return that night or any night after, but this happened less than a month ago. Dana and I sleep with the window closed now, even in summer, even when it's 80 degrees inside. We still don't have a dog yet. Neither of us is ready to let something out into that backyard at night. The man behind the glass. I'm a registered nurse. I've worked in hospitals for going on 8 years. I've seen enough that very little gets under my skin in a clinical setting. I'm telling you this so you understand the weight of what I'm about to say. I quit my job because of what happened one night on the Alzheimer's ward. It was the graveyard shift somewhere around 2 in the morning at a geriatric facility about 30 minutes from where I lived at the time. I'd only been working there for 2 weeks. I was assigned to the memory care unit, a ward full of elderly patients with varying degrees of cognitive decline. Most of them were sweet, confused, and utterly dependent on whoever walked through their door. My presence seemed to mean something to them. I was young. I was awake. I was real. One patient in particular, a woman I'll call Eleanor, was having a rough night. She was in her mid-80s, frail, and she kept summoning me to her room to tell me about the voices she was hearing and the man in the black coat she kept seeing standing in the corner. Her roommate had asked for her curtain closed at the start of my shift, so Eleanor was essentially cut off from her only company. I sat with Eleanor for a while. I held her hands. I told her she wasn't alone, that I was always just a buzzer away, that the noises she heard weren't going to hurt her. After a while, she calmed down enough to fall asleep. I moved on to my other patients. By midnight, the ward was quiet. About an hour later, I was alone in the linen closet, restocking my supply cart. The room was small, windowless, with the door shut. It was the kind of room that was so quiet you could hear the building settle. I had my back to the door when I felt it, a hand on my shoulder, firm, deliberate, large. I spun around so fast I knocked supplies off the shelf. Nothing. No one. The room was empty. I stepped into the hallway, looked both directions. Not a soul. I stood there for a long moment, then talked myself back into that room and finished stocking the cart. I told myself I was overtired. I told myself the feeling was a muscle twitch, an anxiety response, a trick of an exhausted brain. I had just turned around to face the door when I dropped to my knees, screaming. There was a man standing outside the door, through the narrow glass window, close, still, looking directly at me, dressed in black, smiling. My screams brought 3 other nurses running. By the time anyone else reached the door, the man was gone. My colleagues checked every room in the ward, every closet, every bathroom. They found nothing. No visitor badges signed in, no staff unaccounted for, no one. My screaming had woken Eleanor. When I came into her room, still shaking, still white-faced, she reached for my hand and started again about the voices, about the man in black. I asked her as steadily as I could manage to describe him. Was he smiling? Her expression changed. Something in her eyes went sharp and focused in a way I hadn't seen all night. She looked at me and said, "How did you know?" Then she started screaming, "He's coming. Get me out of here. He's coming." I was reassigned to a different ward for the rest of that shift and sent home early. I texted the director the next morning to say my upcoming shift would be my last. I've never experienced a hallucination in my life. I've never been diagnosed with any psychiatric condition. I know what I felt on my shoulder. I know what I saw through that glass. And I know that whatever Eleanor had been describing to me all night matched it perfectly. Make of that what you will. I've spent the past year trying to. The screaming in the woods. I was driving home from a late shift, somewhere around midnight and a half, taking the long back route I always took because the highway was too far out of the way. I'd grown up driving that road. Cornfield on the right, second-growth forest on the left, no streetlights, no traffic. In midsummer it was actually pleasant. Windows down, warm air, nothing but the sound of my engine. I was doing about 50 when the scream cut through everything. A woman's scream. Loud, raw, the kind that comes from genuine panic. I couldn't tell immediately which side of the road it came from. The sound hit the trees and bounced, but I stopped the car fast, got out, and listened. It came again from the left, from the woods. I grabbed the steel baton I kept under my seat and walked toward the tree line. I called out into the dark, "Who's out there? I can hear you." A woman's voice called back, close enough to be real, urgent enough to override all hesitation. "Please help me." I went in. Brush and branches, barely any light. I told her to keep calling out so I could follow the sound. Every 10 seconds or so, "Help!" and I'd adjust my direction and push forward. But here's the thing that I only started to notice after maybe 2 or 3 minutes of this. The voice wasn't getting closer. I was moving fast, running toward the sound, and it stayed the same distance. Same volume, same direction, like it was moving with me. I stopped running. I stood in the dark and listened to the next call for help, and felt the hair on my arms lift. Because that voice was not getting closer. And I'd just run 50 yards into a dark forest alone in the middle of the night to reach it. I turned and ran back the way I came. I made it to my car, locked the doors, and called 911. I reported what I heard and the approximate location and drove home. I didn't sleep that night. 6 days later, a local news segment reported that a woman's body had been discovered by a hiker in those same woods. She was in her early 30s, no signs of foul play according to the initial report. The location matched. I've turned that night over in my mind more times than I can count. The voice that didn't get closer. The feeling that I was being led. I don't have answers. I don't think I want them. Footprints in the snow. Before my girlfriend Claire and I were officially together, we used to spend a lot of time just hanging out. snowboarding mostly, which is how we met in the first place. Her family owned a small cabin up in the mountains of Vermont, close to a major resort, and one winter she invited me up there for the weekend. It was about a 5-hour drive, the last half hour of which was on a winding mountain road where the houses sat far back behind walls of trees and the driveways had no tire tracks in the snow. The cabin was small, cozy, completely off-grid in the sense that there was no running water. Her family kept gallons of bottled water for washing up. The toilet situation meant using the outhouse about 40 feet from the front door. Neither of us minded. We made dinner, watched a movie, fell asleep on the couch. Morning, alarm, coffee, get to the mountain early. On my way to the outhouse, I noticed footprints in the overnight snow. Big ones. I followed the trail and it wrapped around the side of the cabin and disappeared into the woods. I called Claire out to look. She said probably a black bear. They were common up there. We went to the resort, skied for 8 solid hours, ate at a diner on the way back. Good day. That night we had a fire going, music playing, drinks in hand. At some point, I headed out to the outhouse, slammed the door against the cold. I could still hear the music from inside the cabin. And then over it, footsteps, crunching snow, someone walking past the outhouse. I called out Claire's name. No answer. Just footsteps moving away. I texted her, but my reception was too weak to send. A few minutes passed. Then the music stopped. Total silence except for snowflakes hitting the roof. When I stepped out of the outhouse, the cabin lights were off. I used my phone's flashlight and found fresh tracks in the snow leading to the front door, and then continuing around the side. I banged on the door, calling Claire's name. An arm shot out and yanked me inside. She deadbolted the door and whispered in the dark that someone had tried the door handle while I was outside. When she realized it wasn't me, she killed the power and hid in the corner of the living room. She watched someone walk slowly past the window, looking in. Her father had told her once about the storm cellar, a hidden door in the floor with a latch, accessible from the living room. Inside, on a rack on the wall, her family kept 2 rifles and a shotgun. We sat in the dark for a long time. Then the footsteps came back. I loaded the rifle, walked to the front door, opened it, and fired 3 rounds into the air. The footsteps stopped. The echo carried across the mountain. We didn't hear anything after that. We left the next morning at first light, under her father's recommendation. We'd gotten our full day of skiing in. That was about the only good thing that could be said about that trip. The Whistler in the Cornfield. My name is Marcus. I'm 26, the oldest of 3 kids, and I grew up on my family's farm in central Arkansas. My parents have always wanted me to take it over eventually, and for a long time, I went along with that plan. After what happened last July, I started quietly putting together a plan to move. My parents were away on vacation, their first real trip together in years. It was my 2 younger sisters, Bree and Savannah, and me holding down the property for a week. Nothing about that week was supposed to be unusual. The first sign of trouble was the dogs. We had 2, kept chained outside near the back of the house, and they'd been quiet all summer. Around 10 at night, they started losing their minds, both of them in the same direction, toward the corn. I went out to settle them down and stood at the edge of the field and listened. Someone was whistling inside the cornfield. Slow, melodic, human. It wasn't a bird. It wasn't the wind through the stalks. It was a person, confident enough to whistle while trespassing on someone's property in the dark, like they had nothing to worry about. I ran inside and grabbed one of our rifles. My sisters both told me not to go into the cornfield. which was the smartest thing anyone said all night. So instead, I went back out to the dogs, fired one round into the air, and screamed at the top of my lungs for whoever was out there to get off our land. The dogs went quiet. My sisters laughed at my theatrics from the doorway. For about 4 minutes, everything was fine. Then the dogs went insane again. Worse than before. I went back out, and there was a man standing 20 feet from the dogs, right in front of the corn, completely at ease, just looking at me. I yelled at him. He turned and walked calmly into the field. I fired another round into the air and stopped at the edge. I was not going in there. I brought the dogs inside, called my dad, and got the expected lecture about being the man of the house. I lay in bed with the window open and my gun on the nightstand around midnight, whistling. Right outside my window, I looked out and saw a figure walking slowly across the grass below. Then, as if he could sense me watching, he stopped and turned and looked directly at my window, still whistling. Casual as you please. I aimed the rifle out the window and fired at the grass a few feet in front of him. He ran. He did not come back. We never found out who it was or what they wanted. Could have been a bored kid with bad judgment. Could have been something else entirely. I've thought about it enough that I'm not sure which possibility scares me more. The man with no name. I worked the overnight restock shift at a large grocery store in a small town, the kind of place that's the biggest thing in a 20-mile radius. My shift ran 10 at night until 3 in the morning. There were usually 2 of us. That night, my partner called in sick, so I was alone. About an hour into my shift, as I was rotating stock in the bread aisle, I realized I hadn't propped the back door properly. I went to check and found the door stopper, which I'd wedged tight under the door, sitting outside the building. Not loose, not fallen, outside. I called my partner to see if maybe he'd stop by to drop off paperwork or his keys. He picked up from bed, sick and confused, and told me he hadn't been there. Nobody else was scheduled that night. I did a pass through the back room, saw nothing, talked myself into continuing my shift. I was wrong to do that. 20 minutes later, a loud crash echoed from somewhere on the far side of the store. I stood up and walked to the center aisle, the main corridor that ran the full length of the building. I looked toward the back wall. A man in dark clothing walked through the dairy section, crossing the center aisle, and looked directly at me as he passed. I called out. I walked fast toward him. He was at the far end of the aisle, waiting, completely still, facing me. When I got close enough that he could see my face, he turned and walked back the way I'd come. I chased him. By the registers, I found him again, half hidden behind a display shelf, mouth hanging open, slowly waving me toward him. No words, just the wave. I asked who he was. He stepped behind the shelf and disappeared. I went outside to my car and called my manager, who told me to get him out or call the police. I called the police. When the officer arrived, we found the man in the cereal aisle, standing still in the dark, watching the door as if he'd been waiting for us. He was handcuffed without incident. He was one of the stranger human beings I've ever encountered. His eyes were too wide. His smile never left. He kept licking his lips and staring at me while answering the officer's questions. When asked what he was doing in a closed grocery store at midnight, he said he was looking for a snack. He said it like it was the most reasonable thing in the world. I never left a door unlocked again. Not once. The Ouija board and the rock. 8 years ago, my 2 best friends and I did something we absolutely should not have done. We were 19, we were bored, and we lived in a part of New Jersey where entertainment options after dark were limited to gas station parking lots and bad decisions. At the top of a closed hill road near our neighborhood sat an old abandoned church that locals had been breaking into for years. My friend Derek had a Ouija board. Someone, I think it was me, suggested we bring it to the church on a Friday night in October. We parked at the bottom of the hill and walked up in the dark. The building was old, clearly forgotten, surrounded by dense trees and a gravel lot. The front doors weren't locked so much as warped. It took two of us leaning into them to get them open. Inside, graffiti covered everything. The pews were mostly rotted out. Our flashlights caught dust motes in the air. Derek set up the board on the floor and placed 3 candles in a triangle around it. When they were lit, we turned off our phones. The only light was candle glow, which reached maybe 6 feet in all directions. The rest of the church was pure dark. We started. Derek opened with the usual questions. The planchette started moving and we all laughed, because of course one of us was doing it. We didn't take it seriously. We took turns asking dumb questions. The mood was more comedy than horror. Then a sound came from the altar, a loud, sudden crack, like a heavy piece of timber splitting. We all froze. Flashlights up, pointed toward the front of the church. Nothing visible. The building was old. Old buildings make noise. We kept going. The second sound from the altar silenced us mid-sentence, and then something landed on the Ouija board. A rock, roughly the size of a tennis ball, dropped from above and hit the board dead center. All 3 of our hands were on the planchette. Nobody threw it. There was no shelf above us. The ceiling was 25 feet up. We ran. All 3 of us screaming, not stopping, until we reached the car at the bottom of the hill. We sat in the parking lot for 40 minutes, trying to explain what we'd just experienced. Derek, who is deeply religious, was convinced we'd made contact with something. I thought, and still think, that someone else was in that church with us, which is somehow worse. Derek went back the next day to retrieve his board. The candles were still in a triangle on the floor. The board was gone. Bob did something really bad. I'm not someone who spooks easily. I've worked late nights, closing shifts, opening shifts in buildings that felt more haunted than lived in. I was working the overnight at a small gas station on the edge of a rural town when I first met the man who would eventually make me question that confidence. He started coming in around 2 in the morning. Tall, stringy, long dark hair. Always bought the same thing. Always paid cash. He wasn't aggressive, wasn't threatening. He was just off. Not in a diagnosable way. Just off. One night he asked my name. I told him. He repeated it twice, chuckling to himself, then cracked open the can he'd just bought and walked out still talking under his breath. I started watching to see if he drove. He never did. He'd just disappear on foot down the road. A few weeks in, I asked his name. He thought about it for about 5 full seconds and said, "Bob." I didn't believe him for a second, but I went with it. "So, Bob, where do you work?" He let out this enormous laugh that startled me, then said the government had screwed him out of everything. Then he looked at me with this strange mix of anger and warmth and said he liked me because I seemed like someone who understood how things really worked. Then he left. I didn't see him for over a week. Then came the storm. It was a genuinely bad one. Rain hammering the windows, lightning every few minutes, almost no customers. The door chimed and I looked up. Bob. Except this Bob was different. He was completely soaked through. No jacket, no umbrella. Standing just inside the door and staring at the wall. Not at me. At the wall. I said his name. He didn't turn his head. He said, "I did something really bad." I asked what he meant. He turned, looked straight at me and said, "I need somewhere to hide." Then he walked past the register toward the restroom hallway and locked himself in. I did not follow. I stayed behind the counter. The minutes passed. Bob didn't come out. Then the power went out. Complete darkness. A violent storm. A man who said he needed to hide from something he'd done. I used the flashlight from behind the counter and made my way toward the back room to reach the breaker panel. The restroom doors were both ajar as I passed them. Bob was in neither. I pushed into the back room. I heard dripping. I heard wet shoes on the floor. I said his name in the quietest voice I've ever produced. The squeaking moved to my left. I pointed the flashlight. Bob was crouched in the corner, eyes wide open and wild, pupils so large his eyes looked nearly black. He launched himself at me, screaming that he was going to kill me. I shoved him away, ran through the door, grabbed my jacket, and sprinted to my car. I called 911 and sat in the parking lot in the rain until the officers arrived. They found Bob huddled in the back room like a cornered animal. His pupils were blown wide. He was on something, possibly multiple things. They took him in. About 6 weeks later, I found out from a detective who reached out by phone that the man's real name was not Bob. That he had beaten his former partner to death, likely on the same night he walked into my gas station soaking wet, asking for somewhere to hide. I don't work nights anymore. I don't think I ever will again. The piano house. I was 19, working part-time at a local pizza place to cover gas and groceries while I figured out my next move. It was an easy enough job. Take the order, bag it, drive it, collect the tip. I'd done it hundreds of times. This particular order was a chicken parmesan sandwich and a single slice. Small ticket. The address was on a dead-end block with a rural feel to it. A couple of farmhouse-style properties, one house with a battered RV sitting on the grass, and a lot of open space. The house I was looking for sat next to what appeared to be a long vacant property. Overgrown lawn, broken shutters, no lights anywhere, which actually described the house I was delivering to as well. No lights inside, front door slightly ajar. I approached the porch and knocked. Rang the bell. The bell didn't work. And then I heard it, piano music, coming from somewhere inside the house, muffled, like it was being played in a room with closed doors between us. The melody was simple, slow, repetitive. I walked around back and knocked on the rear door. Nobody answered. I called the restaurant to confirm the address. It was correct. So I went back to the front, pushed the door open, and called out that the delivery was here. The piano stopped. A voice from somewhere in the dark said, "Over here." The piano started again. The smell inside stopped me. Musty and sharp, like the house had been closed up for a long time. No lights anywhere. I called out again from just inside the door. The piano stopped. Silence. Then the voice said he had trouble walking. Could I just bring it in through the living room? I stood in that foyer and thought about it. I pictured some elderly man who'd ordered a meal and couldn't get up from his chair. I felt guilty about what I was about to do. But I also didn't walk straight in. Instead, I edged toward the living room entrance and peered around the wall with one eye. The piano bench was empty. The piano had been playing, but no one was sitting at it. I was out the front door in under 3 seconds. I drove straight back to the restaurant and told my manager. He didn't argue with me. The fact that the alleged customer never called back to complain about his missing order told us everything we needed to know. After my shift, I looked up the address online. The house had been foreclosed on and vacated over 8 months prior. Nobody had lived there since. Whatever was in that house, whoever was in that house, was waiting for someone to walk through the living room to reach a room that no one had any business being let into. I drove back routes with music on after that. Loud music, windows up. Tip or no tip, I never delivered to a street I didn't recognize without doing a slow pass first. These stories are over, but the places in them still exist. The desert is still dark past the porch light. The woods behind the new house in Georgia are still there. The abandoned church on the hill hasn't been torn down. The gas station is still open at 2 a.m. The dead-end road still leads somewhere. Stay safe out there.